introduce Dr. Yasmin Kafai. I can honestly say that if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here right now. She actually wrote one of my qualifying exams and was a reader on my qualifying exams. So I actually realized this morning, I think I've known her for 17 years now.
That makes me really old.
No, you were 13 at the time, so, and I was 5. I have to say this before we get started. Thank you for joining us today. This lecture is being live broadcast on the GSA's YouTube channel. The recording will also be archived and accessible there later this afternoon. While the camera and microphone are oriented to the front of the room, please note that any audience contributions or questions may be captured on the broadcast and recording. So be aware. Yasmin is a professor of the learning sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, and she is also the chair of the Teaching, Learning, and Leadership Division. She's a researcher and co-developer of online tools, including Scratch, StitchFest, and eCrafting to promote computational participation, crafting, and creativity across the K-16. She has a number of books. Some of the recent ones are called Connected Play, Tweens in a Virtual World, Minds in Play, Computer Game Design, and the Context for Children's Learning, as well as some edited volumes named Textile Messages, Dispatches from the World of Electronic Textiles and Education, Beyond Barbie and Mortal Kombat. Sounds very entertaining. New Perspectives on Gender and Gaming, and the Computer Clubhouse, Constructionism and Creativity in Youth Communities. She earned her doctorate from Harvard University, where she worked with Seymour Papert at the MIT lab, Media Lab, and she is a fellow of AERA and a past president of ICLS. So with no further ado, Yasmin Kafai.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Dan. Yes, a long, long time. You were all young and innocent at the time, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. And as you probably gathered from the list, we're going to talk about programming today, computer science education. A very interesting topic, which in particular in graduate schools of education, but in education in general, has not received a lot of attention over the last 20 years, but this is changing now. But there was a time period 20, 30 years ago when I was working with Seymour Papert. Believe it or not, we actually had millions of kids programming. So my talk today is about a little bit about the history, what happened that we as a society collectively decided not to do programming, and why is it making a comeback now. And then I also want to kind of put a pitch. I think even though not much research happened over the last 20, 25 years, I think we learned a few things from that first wave of programming in school, which we should take into account as we're kind of gearing up nationwide across the states. CS certification standards for teachers are being put into place. Hour of code increasing of millions. So I think this is the next big challenge for graduate schools of education, where you, and not just the computer scientists, should have a voice on what is happening. And this was actually my slide here, because there has been some activity over the past few years on reports that we only have a few thousand certified computer science teachers, but over 20 or 25,000 high schools. So even if we achieve, of getting 20,000 high school teachers, we know it will be a very lonely existence for them, because there will be one in their schools. And that does only begin to describe the tip of the iceberg. What I want to do today in looking at the agenda for computer science in K-12 education, that's really my focus. I want you to focus, I will tell you 2 stories. And one of them is around computational thinking. And who has heard that term, computational thinking? So there's a few people, you will hear more about it. And I will talk about what that is, and that there's no agreement on what that is. But I also suggest that we kind of cast a wider net, thinking about computational participation rather than just the kind of mental cognitive effort. And the second piece I want to bring home in my talk today is to, you heard probably also about broadening participation in computing. We need to bring more people. There's hardly any women, any minorities in a field which now impacts every aspect of our life. You all probably carry smartphones, which are more powerful than the computers which had 30 years ago in classrooms. So what I want to also shift the attention, yes, broadening participation is good, but we should also think about deepening participation, because that's where I think the next challenge will be. So those are the two pieces which will kind of frame what I talked to. Only two things you need to remember from the talk, and then, I mean, you're golden. And so let me start with the literacy part, because, I mean, for anything we do in education, whether it's reading, writing, or arithmetic, also the typical 3 R's, I mean, that's essentially what drives a lot of what people do research here about learning and teaching, about policy, on how that's defined. And then sometimes if people are generous, they include the arts. I think they should be part. And that's why the title of my talk, Programming, also happens to be Coding Doesn't. Programming has an R as a 5th literacy. And that's a lot of conversation today, you know, that programming shouldn't be optional, but it actually should be a 5th literacy. And I think if we can agree that that's an important agenda, I think we also need to talk about what do we actually mean by literacy. And I'm very fond of by the way, is that okay if I move, or do I have to kind of stay tethered to the, I'm just looking, okay, I'll be here. A literacy which Sylvia Scribner, a long-time literacy researcher, suggested, and she said when we talk about literacy, we actually mean 3 things. And the first one she talks about is literacy as adaptation. It's kind of the functional part. We learn to read and write in order to participate in society, read books, read contracts, write letters of newspapers, to be informed citizen. And I think most of the discussions we have in society focus on that first part, the adaptation part. But there are 2 other parts which are equally important. And one of them is literacy as power, and this is, I guess, like a Freire argument. It looks about literacy as political participation. You know, we become literate in order to participate in society, to make decisions about, you know, should we have a nuclear plant in our backyard? What should happen with energy, with climate change? I mean, the topics are endless. And so technically also we should think about that being technically fluent or literate wherever programming comes in is not just about being functional in the language of computers. It is also a power part, because all aspects of our life, 24/7, technology is there. And then there's the third part, literacy as grace. And I think we hear very little about it, but I think it's equally important. And it's this personal part. I mean, because we become literate, I mean, to vote and love letters. Okay, today nobody writes love letters. You compose a 140-character tweet, but even that is a literate act. And so we use technology to communicate, to connect, to socialize. I mean, the personal part, which is equally important. And I think when I think about programming as a 5th R, as a literacy, I think about all of these parts. It's not just the coding, the functional part, talking with computers. It is also a political act, because we need, I mean, to be able to have a voice in the digital public on how it's being designed and constructed, whether Facebook decides to do research on our things and what that means. With the data mining, whether it's privacy, data security, there's so many issues where we need to have a voice. And then lastly, it's a personal aspect. And I think probably every single one in this room can speak that we use technology for a lot of personal entertainment parts. So my first part of the talk will really focus on the computational thinking part and how we can kind of move from there to a more broader conception of computational participation. And what I want to show you, I'm not sure whether you have seen the video from code.org.
Here we are, 2013. We all depend on technology to communicate, to bank, and none of us know how to read and write code.
The first program I wrote asked things like, what's your favorite color? Or how old are you?
I wrote a program to play
tic-tac-toe.
I first learned how to make a green circle and a red square appear on the screen.
You're just trying to make something, trying to transfer something from your mind to the computer or to the tablet. It's an experience.
The whole limit in the system is just that there just aren't enough people who are trained and have these skills today.
The programmers of tomorrow are the wizards of the future. You know, you're going to look like you have magic powers compared to everybody else.
Great coders are today's rock stars. That's it.
So there is there's a longer version where you can get heard extol the virtues of programming, wizardry, the powers of being. It's very charming. This video came out, I think, last year in February, and within 10 days it had millions of views. And even I realized that the field has changed, because before this video 2 or 3 years ago probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of traction, but now suddenly Code.org, which was funded by Silicon Valley, very successful entrepreneur Heidi Patovi, decided to kind of push this job skill agenda, which is kind of really the functional part on it. And there's this quote, which is not in the short version, but it's in the long version, from the late Steve Jobs, which, like many of the other quotes, everybody in this country should learn how to program a computer because it teaches you how to think. And I think that is very powerful as well as very problematic, because it looks, again, as programming just as thinking and leaves aside all the social and cultural ramification. But it also kind of points the finger to this term computational thinking, which Janet Wang, who was a professor at computer science, she now works for Microsoft, then wrote. It was a short essay, 4 or 5 pages, where she tried to kind of articulate what's special about computer science. And here is the definition she put forward. Involves solving problems, designing systems, and understanding human behavior using the fundamental concepts of computer science. There's nothing at first glance wrong with this definition, which, by the way, I was part of an NRC workshop series where we're trying to put our heads around, can we come to an agreement on what that actually means? We can't. But computational thinking has become the rallying cry for introducing programming back into school. And so there are tons of different ideas, the problem solving, the system, which actually tie nicely back 20 years ago when people brought programming for the first time in the schools. It was also around planning and problem solving. And we also know that that really wasn't enough to get most of the kids going and interested. And I think this narrow definition is actually a detriment to where we are, and that we think about programming not just what happens in the mind and between the machine, but more in a rather cultural, social way. Then we have a broader sense to tackle the issues like these, that if you look at AP computer science, there are actually states out there where not one student has taken the exam, and many others where not one woman, not one minority. And this AP exam is not the end for all for understanding. I mean, as a benchmark for computational fluency, but I think it's a signpost that of all the AP exam, computer science is the least popular, and it has been for the last 20, 30 years. If you look at the numbers, women in the mid-70s, 80s, were actually 30% of all the computer science students, and that percentage has slowly decreased over the last 20 years, and not much headway has been made, except for Harvey-Mudd College, where Maria Klav is president. There are some efforts where this has worked. So, and this is just from a gender perspective, let alone if you look at ethnic and racial diversity, which exists, virtually non-existent. So these pieces have always been kind of really where the challenge is, that even if you just look at programming as computer science, will never kind of makes a change. But when we broaden it to participation, nearly 20 years ago, I show this image. We actually had computers in school and were working on visions on how this could move beyond the kind of making your code, going once a week for 45 minutes in the computer lab. You know, when it's holiday time, you learn how to program a Christmas tree. You know, when Easter comes along, there's an Easter bunny which hops across screen, and then you go back to the rest of your classes which have nothing to do. So the idea was really, can we think about integration? Rather than to kind of look at it as a standalone activity, can we think about ways on how this kind of can become part of the other curriculum, this will be one of my contentions for K to 12, this is really the road to go. Because most people will not become computer scientists. They will become computer end users and will learn and need a little bit of coding, some understanding. They're not going to design the big systems. But the much larger group of end users, whether it's spreadsheet programming or anything else, there are in the millions which are out there, and we make no preparation for them. So I'm happy to kind of show you, this is like long, long time ago. Those were 256K machines when they came out. And this was actually my thesis project 25 years ago. Kids programming fraction games.
It's demo time for parents at the Hennigan School in Boston.
He will ask you a fraction problem. If you get it wrong, you will become mentally disordered.
I don't know what's wrong with it.
After months of work, the fifth grade students are showing off the computer games they created. Even the principal is here to take a try. The children are using the programming language Logo, invented by this man, Seymour Papert. As part of a bold MIT Media Lab experiment known as Project Headlight, Papert, his research team, and the Hennigan teachers are developing methods to put inner-city children in charge of their own learning. Instead of using purchased software like most schools, Project Headlight challenges the students to use Logo to create their own software.
How do you decide what to put in your messages when you get it right? Well, they're basically all the same. I don't know. It's not being right and it was right. What do you say when they're wrong? That's wrong. How do you think again?
In the design process, they become expert programmers. They draw, manipulate shapes, even guide a skier down the slope. And like all the students, this one is built in a surprise. When the skier hits a bald spot, a fraction quiz. No run-of-the-mill video games. These are designed to teach mathematics. Abigail has chosen to design her fraction game around the Greek myths.
You want to go to the home of Zeus, but the map was ripped up by the Greek god Hades. All the Greek gods and goddesses have a fraction in the map. You're to go to the gods and goddesses one at a time.
Her toughest challenge involves allowing the user to choose an answer from the quiz. She's had to learn the hows and whys of the ifs and thens.
The hardest thing about this is making the program for what's your answer is fraction time. Like, if you push A, then you do this, and then if you push B, then this happens, and C, then this other thing happens. So it's really hard.
The fact that a 9-year-old is learning such sophisticated programming concepts is a testament to Project Headlight's success. And for Abigail, the command of the computer allows her to devote her attention to what she really enjoys. Designing a Nintendo-style interface and creating a compelling story around the gods. Ginny has designed her fraction game around a spider web. Like her classmates, she's learned advanced programming. She's also learned the advantage of producing her own game.
Because you make your own game and you can play it anytime you want. But in Nintendo, this right here, you don't have to buy it because you're the one who's making it.
With Nintendo as a model, she's even designed her own game box.
Like at first I didn't know how to design the web, and so the art teacher helped me and I designed it.
In fact, as part of the project, all of the children package their games and promote them with an ad campaign. These integral activities make this project unlike any textbook exercise. The students here are designing a real product from start to finish. And through the process, they learn about every advertising medium. They even produce TV commercials.
To play this game, play it good, you may grow up to be like Ronald Reagan. Wow. Town is awesome. It's spooky, it's scary, and it's exciting. And it's about TCA. Awesome.
So I think this gives you some idea, because this wasn't just about learning programming. It was also connected to the math class where students were learning about fractions. They were designing these games. These were instructional games to teach younger and the students who would come in every month to kind of provide feedback. But it was also connected to the language arts class where they were developing advertisements and reading about the myth, as you could imagine, how that came along. And to the arts class, you know, those were the days when you actually bought games in packaged boxes too. Nowadays, that's gone. And the point, and we actually, in an evaluation with control classes who learned programming and math in a different way, we found significant increased understanding of mathematics as well as programming, which probably is not surprising if you spend more time kind of developing a fairly complex system, a piece of software, that you get more programming. And this is one of the big takeaway points. It wasn't just 1 or 2 hours or 3-4 hours which kids spend on programming. They actually spent several weeks. And then when this project, this was in June, came over, when we came back in September, they continued working on their game. And then in November, I told them, you know, guys, I have to write my dissertation. So, you know, the project is over now. They probably would have spent a whole year on refining and making the games. And all of this was actually coming out of Seymour Pappert's work. And many might say Mindstorm, which was a book which came out in 1980, which I think initiated a paradigmatic shift in how people thought about children and computers, because believe it or not, at the time, the idea that 9-year-olds would actually spend an hour programming on a computer, even at any computer, was fairly unheard of. But Mindstorms, this is the old logo turtle, by the way, which was a physical object first, really, I think, sets the stage for us to think about learning programming and pedagogy in general. And I like to do always a kind of quick primer, because many people have forgotten what the book was about, and that it actually lays out in fairly understandable ways on how we can kind of think the main premises. And one of the first pieces which Seymour always argued, you know, he was very much influenced by Piaget's theory, and he thought about programming as an object to think with. So when you program, you think about, and these objects are really interesting because they also are shareable with others, so you can talk about what you're doing. Others can look at it and comment on it. We know from a lot of educational research which focuses on collaboration, whether it's programming, science, or mathematics, that this is a really instrumental part, this kind of sharing of the objects you create and discuss them of learning. So this was just, I mean, before the social cultural revolution initiated by Jean Lave and Wenger and many others kind of came about, which already articulated this notion of objects. Another aspect Seymour was always fond of, he never thought that programming should be this kind of solitary activity, and more than often we see the image of a guy just glued to the screen as a prototype of kind of programmer. He always thought it should be something like the Samba schools, where we have people of different experience, of new dancers, of old dancers, where things are geared towards a performance at the end, being the Brazilian carnival, that this should become the model. And if you read this and compare this to many of the description by Lave and Wenger about apprenticeship learning, you will find a lot of resonance there. Unfortunately, a lot of our classrooms don't look anything like this. They didn't look like that 30 years ago, nor today. And then the third component was always cultural, because that is a part, how we think about learning and teaching mathematics, what's being valued, which approaches. And that's very similar in programming, which many associated with planning top-down. And he was always very fond to kind of promote the tinkering, the bottom-up, but simply for the fact that one way of thinking of doing computers was always kind of presented as the only and right way. And I think, again, we have, tons of research, both from the cognitive side, which had studied children's strategies, and there are many, many ways to do addition or subtraction problems. Not all of the approaches are equally successful later on, but that we need to kind of step away from thinking wider net. And then lastly, there's another piece which kind of around tangible aspects, which I think nowadays, if you are familiar with the maker movement, where there's a lot of emphasis of kind of making your own artifacts. And the turtle image, which I showed you earlier, actually programming this logo started out with a physical turtle. It was a big turtle, and it had a big, big, big cable to a big, big mainframe at the time. But this idea that learning isn't just, textual representation, it's really across different. And so I think these pieces all also suggest, when we think about learning and teaching programming, we need to move away just from thinking of objects to think with, because that's a very kind of individualized focus. In today's and so what I want to discuss with you is looking at the research on programming in K-12, where we were and where we should go. I think there are kind of three major shifts, which actually tie really nicely into those theoretical foundations from constructionism, from code to applications, not just to learn coding, but to do it in a context. From social, from tools to community, there's an awful time, and it's computer scientists, they can help themselves. They want to design programming languages, but we really need to think these. And then also cultural, we need just to think from designing from scratch, but also remix, because today's media culture is a remix culture, and there's hardly anybody who programs from scratch, no pun intended. People actually Google libraries and then kind of repurpose code. So let me say a little bit on what I mean from code to application. For some of you who have done some programming, the text on the left is probably familiar. That's kind of what your typical program looks like. We started designing Scratch in 2002 with Mitchell Resnick at the MIT Media Lab. We picked a visual programming interface, which essentially minimizes typos, syntax mistakes, and you move blocks around. And I think that's an important innovation, and many programming languages today have a visual interface, which for beginners is really helpful. It gets a little bit more complicated when you do complex programs. But I think that's not the only thing, because what we focusing when we code something, what are we making? And so there are tons of stuff, whether it's games, stories, music videos, animations. What I showed you with the Project Headlight project was kind of one of the examples, the leftovers from the first wave of programming, that we really need to think about coding in context. We're making things with code. And that's very much aligned with Janet Wing's, designing systems for user interfaces. There's nothing wrong with this. So let's move away from the coding for the sake of coding to thinking about the many artifacts, the apps you have on your phone you can use. I think another shift is there are tons of programming environments. I know this is a space many of you are probably not in, but I think computer scientists just love designing programming tools. And we have Logo alone has about 200 variants, and that's not the end of it. And that's just Logo. I mean, there is Greenfoot, there is Agent Sheets, there is Alice. I mean, you just name it. We have tons and tons of tools. And I don't want to devalue the work of my colleagues, because we spend a lot of time thinking what those programming tools for beginners should look like so they have an easy access. But I don't think I think it's only half of the story. And I think with Scratch, we illustrated, because when we in 2007 released the programming tool Scratch, we also released it immediately with a community. There's a button in Scratch, you can say, upload my program, and you become instantly part of the Scratch community, which is now the world's largest used programming community. It has about 8 million projects. 1 million's been translated in over 20 languages. And so I think you see now many other tools who come with a community built in, or when the community is things around. And I think that makes a big difference whether you program just alone on your own, and some people might enjoy that. But rather, when you go on there, you can see, you can spend days just looking at all the programs which have been designed. And many of them are around popular book series. The Warrior from Aaron Hunter, Warriors of the Sky. Yes, it's not your age level, it's 10 and 11, and they're a challenge for us to read. There are gigantic communities around this where kids create animations and tell their own stories. Hundreds, thousands of games designed. And my point is, we know that learning is social, that not everything kind of is done on your own, that you need a social context. And when we think about bringing programming back into schools, we need to think about community, whether it's a classroom community or whether it's an online community, of which there are many, so that people can kind of recreate this shared experience. And I don't have time to talk about a recent grant with Mitchell, where we looked on how we can kind of actually engineer these kind of open source style of programming collaboratives you find on places like Newgrounds and others, where people kind of come together to make their own movies, their own video games. And you see some of that, by the way, also here on Scratch. It's a new form of collaboration. Very different from what we do in school, where we tell people, you know, you two, you know, work together. Peer program, by the way, is a very popular and also very effective way, which is used both on the college as well as the K-12 level. So the other piece I want to talk about is from scratch to remix, no pun intended. So I think in school often we have this idea we need to start with a blank page. You really need to build everything. That has been pretty much the strategy for most of the programming activities. But what I would like to contend is really that this is not very much linked to the informal practices which most kids have, because they remix music, they remix graphics, and also actually 43% of the Scratch projects on the site are remixes. And Andres Monroy Hernandez, who is, by the way, the designer of the Scratch community site, did his thesis on all these remixes. This is what you see on the right side there is a remix tree of a popular project, and you can see how these remixes kind of migrate through a community. And you also did some really interesting research that some remixes are just copies. You know, you just put your name on it, and then the copycat police comes and turns into vigilantes, and you'll get a lot of problems, which is a whole nother issue around copyright. But some remixes are also very generative. They kind of actually create new versions and get kids to kind of move beyond the original. So we actually do have some information that remixes can kind of provide different affordances. And they're also much more in link with youth media culture. When we designed Scratch, it was intentionally designed for manipulating media, because we observed in many community centers there was a vibrant Photoshop culture. I don't know how many images of kids with Chris Brown, who was very popular at the time, not now, were there in Photoshop. So we use this as an inspiration for the programming language, and I think the cultural practices need to follow. The problem is that in schools, this kind of remixing is often considered cheating. So we have a very interesting clash between different cultures to deal with on what happens outside of school, where there is voluntary programming. So I want to kind of wrap this part up here. So when I wrote the book with Quinn Burke, who was before that a doctoral student at Penn, and he's a former English high school teacher who I converted into researching storytelling with programming, because I felt the computer scientists only focused on the programming. They never quite knew what to make with the stories. And he was able to bring this perspective to bear. We were trying to articulate what this new version of computational thinking should look like. And it doesn't get rid of computational thinking. I think the idea of designing systems, of problem solving around human behavior, those are all important aspects. But we need to think about them not just from the individual, really from a community perspective, which allows participation in network communities. And that allows me, I mean, unless you have questions, to jump into the second part, which is around kind of when we think about computational participation, is it just about broadening, or should we kind of move a step further to think about deepening participation? And I want to discuss this from 3 different perspectives, about deepening access, deepening activities, and deepening communities, because I think participation can kind of be broken out into these components. And if you think about deepening access, I think we really need to make a concerted effort now to reach to all those underrepresented communities. And there are many efforts right now. I put some of them out here: Black Girls Who Code, Girls Who Code. And I've always been very much against single-sex interventions, but the situation is so dire in CS education in general that I think we need to create these spaces where we bring people together. And there's a really nice video from Google, which I'm not going to show you right now, which for the first time kind of illustrates also how there can be different connecting points for girls into computing. Because I think otherwise, I mean, we're never going to overcome, I mean, the decades of disenfranchisement in computing. Beyond access, I also think we need to deepen communities. And Scratch is actually a great example. I mean, you all can go to Scratch. It's freely available thanks to, you know, your NSF funding dollars and other support. And that's good. But we started actually 2 years ago doing some kind of big data analysis on the back end. Who is actually participating? So if you look at the current rate, you can see the projects, users, and comments. So the Scratch community isn't just about the programming projects. It also has a kind of Facebook-like commenting style feature incorporated, and you can see from its start in 2007 that it really has just after code.org you experience now exponential growth. So it's actually everybody participating. So what we did, we sampled 5,000 users from 20,000 users who logged in January. So it was a double randomized sample. It pulled down the projects, comments, everything they did, and looked at what they were doing. What we found right away that we can evenly kind of divide the group into 2. One of them are the creators, the people who actually uploaded a project, and the others are the browsers who leave virtually no trace otherwise. They just have logged in, but they haven't done any project, any programming. So what you see there is that 1/2 of the community actually is kind of more lurking, kind of not doing much. I mean, not in the sense of programming. By the way, this is still the version of Scratch where you have to push a button to upload. The current version, which was released in 2012, allows you to do live programming on the side. So we're trying to kind of replicate this finding. And when we look at the creators, what we also find is that they get divided up into one group: high network, general networkers, people who mostly comment, people who download a lot of software, and some of them who do very little. And lo and behold, the high networkers are the people who pretty much stay in their group over a 3-month time period. So we had data from January to March 2012. And that's a really interesting finding, that there's a group which is a fairly small percentage of the users, just 6%, who is consistently very active. And this, by the way, is very typical of massive communities. If you look at World of Warcraft, I mean, any of the others, there's a fairly small percentage of people who drive, 5% who drive 95% of all the traffic. And then the rest is kind of more on the periphery. But what we found also that people, I mean, if they shift categories, your likelihood of becoming one of those very active people is very low. You rather kind of move out. So even though we have a lot of traffic on Scratch, we do know that not a lot of people are participating. And we started doing some more latent class analysis on how this breaks out by programming complexity. And what you see is that the people who use a lot of loops, which is a fairly easily accessible concept, there are many of them, and then when you come to broadcast variables, operators, this kind of goes down. And the class, which the biggest class is the people who use little of anything. And then the upper class, the black class, is those 8%, the high net workers, they use everything. Another finding which is not represented here is that unfortunately, most of the newcomers are in the low class, which is probably not that surprising. They're just starting out to learn programming, but they're also the majority of girls are there. So what we have here is a community which by design is open to all, but not everybody participates equitably. And the reason why I'm making this point is that we need to be very careful that ed schools actually have an important role, because if we go by choice, which is a voluntary participation, joining is fairly hard to do if you're a newcomer, figuring out what that means to become a member of Scratch. Participating, we know that the girls are perpetuating some of the same patterns which we have found. By the way, the reason why I don't have any information on minorities is because that information is not collected when people log in. We're doing right now a type of web crawler analysis to get at that data. And then in terms of equity, it only appeals to 5%. Those are probably the 5% of the kids who always raise their hand and participate in class. And that's okay if you are in an informal setting. I mean, where it's free choice, free will, which is the mantra of informal education. But it's not okay when we are in schools, because there we have a different agenda. We're aiming, we're not necessarily getting to a 100% joining, participating in order to achieve equity. And so communities like Scratch, which go open and free access for anybody who wants to learn programming, great. But we also know now that only a small percentage actually engage. And this will not be the vehicle by which we can achieve let alone broadening participation. And as we looked at the programming complexity, we also know we need to push kids beyond that first project into more deeper activities, beyond the kind of initial interest. And I think my last point will be that in terms of deepening activities, we also need to think about a broader array which we engage in CS education. So robotics is a really popular topic, but over the last 20 years has also failed to bring in girls. I mean, at most you have 1/3 of the girls participating. Gaming is actually an equally not very diverse field. And so why do we ask girls to program games into computing, to join a fraternity, which in the outside world is not very equitable either? So one of my suggestions has been to kind of look at other artifacts, because there's so much stuff, whether it's electronic textiles. Have anybody of you heard of the lily pad Arduino Adafruit? So electronic textiles are essentially what's called soft computing, and you can see it there in the upper left corner. It's a microcontroller, which is sewable, and you use conductive thread rather than wires to stitch your circuits. And then you can hook up actuators, which are like LEDs, they go on and off, or speakers, or sensors. You can make the whole thing interactive, and you can create clothing or wearables, which are very popular right now, which essentially interact with the environment, whether they have, you know, a health function to measure your temperatures, whether they can have like the turn signal jacket when you're biking, you know, you can signal right and left with a twitch on your fingers. So they just kind of give a different opportunity. It's like if in language art and English class we only would be reading Shakespeare because it's kind of like the best book, but we know there's much more literature around there, and some of which speaks to different audiences. And electronic textiles are really nice because they kind of connect the history of female crafting to kind of a mostly male domain of engineering, circuit design, and computing. And most people don't think about computing in relation to textiles. They should though, because the first computer program was created by Lady Ada Lovelace for programming the Jacquard weaving machines. And so the origins of computing arguably actually come from textiles, and many programmers initially were women before the profession changed. Nathan Ensmenger at Indiana University has written a fantastic book called The Computer Boys Take Over that illustrates this change. So I'm just throwing this out there. There's printed electronics, there's so many different things. So when we bring computing back into K-12, we should kind of have a broad perspective. Yes, games, programming games is great. Robotics are a great collaborative experience, but there's so much more to do. And so deepening access, deepening participation, and deepening activities are really key in achieving the goal. I want to leave you with a kind of perspective on why this kind of approach to CS education makes sense, because if you take Sylvia Scribner's definition of literacy in 3 metaphors, we can all agree on the functional level, on the adaptation level, that kids need to have some code. That doesn't mean they need to become computer scientists, they need to go and study computer science. But just understand the basics on how hard it is to design interfaces, because you never know what the user is going to do or not to understand. But then we also, on a political level, we really need to make sure, because computing isn't just about interacting with the computer, it's also understanding the systems which surround your everyday life, and that all of them are designed entities. Somebody designs this, and that also means it can be changed. And you need to have a voice in the digital public, I think. I mean, long time ago, if you want to have an analogy, in making city more livable spaces, people realized that the public needed a voice in urban planning in order to make spaces livable for everyone, not just a few. And I would argue that likewise in computing, this is also a political agenda, because the digital public is a space for all of us, not just a few, whether it's about access to the internet, about whether you get access to a fast line or not. All of those are important topics which impact us. And then likely on a personal level, again, computing is not excluded from that. It really touches upon these 3 levels. And I mean, some fluency is important. So I think what we are trying to say in Connected Code was, when Seymour Papert started out in Mindstorms 1980, he very much kind of looked at the computer as an expressive tool, an object to think with, to share with. What I would argue today in a networked community, we really need to kind of focus on this element of connectivity. And this is why the book is called Connected Code, because code isn't just there about interfacing, it's also about connecting with each other. And so I'll leave you with the hard job of finding the right book cover, because you have no idea how hard it is to find images of girls at a computer who are talking with each other rather than staring. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
So I guess I'm thinking, so like going from code to applications, tools to communities, those seem like very worthwhile goals, but then the idea that schools are potentially give you the opportunity to provide some more equitable access to those. I guess I'm wondering, schools don't seem to be very good at those things in particular. And so what gives you sort of a, I don't know, makes you think that schools could help you with that problem, could help push that, or maybe they aren't the right place to do that?
I think there are actually Z plays as much as there's so much negative discussion around public schools, and schooling in general, and teaching. What I just showed you with the Scratch analysis is that it's not enough just to put all the stuff there, because Scratch has been doing this for 5 years. And it's, by the way, something which is not really visible when you just go to the site. It's really the one case where I'm in agreement that we need to do big data analysis when we have massive communities, because we can't understand the networks. They're not visible at first glance. You need these kind of analyses. And we know that these communities, as great as they are, they just perpetuate the same kind of disparities we have. And we have such strong disparities in CS education. I mean, think about, there are places like Montana, Wyoming. Nobody takes the AP CS exam. I mean, you know, we can have an argument whether AP is great or not, but it's a signal for something. Nobody. I mean, what does that mean for the kids? You know, that means very likely that the kids don't have any access to those courses. And we also know if you don't do it in high school or before, the chances of you going into college and picking up are close to zero. So that means we'll never change the pipeline or the network. And that's where I think K-12 education comes in, because even if we do a lousy job, and you know, not all instruction is great, whether it's computing or anything, and we don't have enough teachers who are prepared, we're reaching larger numbers and we can make a difference, especially if we start at the elementary and middle school level. Then by high school, kids can make an informed decision whether they want to take the AP course. I'm not saying everybody should take an AP course, but they should at least have some beyond PowerPoint and typing. You know, that is not the end for all of technology, computing education. I'm sorry. I mean, or even making a web page, you know, just click and point. So that's why I think schools have an important role. And the reason why this is important, I have a lot of discussions with code.org, who's promoting the code, the piecemeal approach. And I told them you can't do this because we know from thousands of studies in the 1970s and 80s that kids don't get much out of this. You know, programming the Easter Bunny to hop across the screen is cute, but it doesn't connect to anything. And you do those 4 or 5 hours, and then you're left with nothing. And so I got them now to consider, because they're offering free training to people, professional development all over the United States, and they do have an important voice, even though I wouldn't necessarily agree with the agenda. It's all around the job skills, because who knows what 20 years from now the skills are. And my agenda is a really much more humanistic one in terms of coding. I said you need to provide the other examples of more project-based, integrated, that at least people can make a choice on what they want to teach. If you just promote one model, then that's all what there is. And that's not enough, because we already, you can look at the old Logo literature, and Pascal and Modular, these are names from the past, I know, but they were once very popular. So we do know that already. We don't need to repeat this. Even if it's 20, 30 years ago, and those were 256K machines, it doesn't matter. Okay, next person. Yes?
So building on that piece of where, you know, that it can't just be code, it needs to extend to applications. There was a small moment in your presentation where you said something about copyright, you know, and then you glossed over it real quick and kept going. And yet, that's the power side to me, like of the 3 pieces that you said, that power piece is in there. And it seems to me that that power piece is missing from almost everything that, you know, in my experience going to school, I'm not taught law, I'm not taught civic law, I'm not taught, you know, how to finance things, what copyright is, and so to create that sort of ability for the kids to take this, how do you see this providing that avenue towards getting that power and the knowledge of that powerful action, so that they could become the entrepreneur or innovator that, you know, is the buzzwords of today?
Yeah.
You can't do that. You get fleeced by companies who steal your stuff. So.
Well, and even if they steal your stuff, you need to have money to pay a big
Exactly.
lawyer, and then you're not winning anyway, because you never can compete with Google and the money resources. But I think, you know, when kids start developing their own applications, and I had several instances when I worked 20 years in headlights, where somebody was programming the Simpsons music, and then the big question came out because they had programmed in a logo where now they originated, because other things of music too. And so we had actually, you know, we call these kind of situated discussions around copyright. Who owns the code or the song? And so every time you make something, you can have actually a context to discuss this. And with the remix culture, you know, Andres did a really nice study. He actually, the system gives you automatically credit if you copy code. There's a nice paper which I think is actually published in Science Journal, Computers Can't Give Credit. And so I think you have opportunities not to kind of teach this in abstract, oh yes, there's copyright, you shall not do this. Within these kind of contexts, people create their own code, their own images, or even if they take the images and repurpose them, you can situate all of these discussions which we have today on what is okay to share, when it's fair sharing, and when it's not. Because it's based on personal design, but it also often leverages discusses in context. And I think that is a much more meaningful discussion than one where you give people the copyright law and say, here are the rules, which go in here and out there, and you've forgotten, I mean, the minute you leave class. I want to talk on some women too, because I just called on two guys. So hey, we have to, you know, we can't only just talk about equity, we need to also practice. So. Yes, okay, sorry, you'll come later.
So my question is, what you just addressed, sort of addressing this question, what you just said applies to the kids and the users that want to follow the rules. But what about the ones that don't? The ones that are going to go on the site, they're going to copy code, they're going to go to a different site that doesn't have your information about that this is someone else's code, they're going to upload it and then somehow, you know, get some kind of recognition for somebody else's stuff.
What's going to stop that? I mean, it's
not sharing the code.
Well, the information is out there, and this is just Scratch. If you look at C++, which is a gaming business language right now, people publish all kind of libraries on there. People start with taking pieces of code and repurposing. And I would actually suggest, when you write your first program, you start with something somebody else has already written. You know, there's no need for you to start from a blank page. And then you quickly, one thing I learned, and I have done projects now with hundreds, not thousands of kids, once you start developing, you know, have to write some code, you become much more appreciative on what that means, you know, what other people's work actually means. If it's just a discussion in the abstract because you have never designed anything in the digital public and put it out there, then there's very little incentive for you to make connections, and it's a kind of, you know, discussion about possibilities. But here, you're actually making things, and you have that kind of discussion between classmates, as well as you can look at the community. When you put up something on the Scratch site, somebody picks it up. So I think this is a teachable moment.
So are there any models for teacher educator preparation for building some of this out?
Oh, you're just hoping for it. No, there's the one big program which my colleague Jane Margolis and Joanna Gode at UCLA did is called ECS, Exploring Computer Science. It's a pre-AP course. They've actually been very successful now in Los Angeles with hundreds of teachers. They also have a very high turnover rate, like 50% of the teachers which they have trained have already gone. But they're also in 5 other cities, and that's a fairly extensive curriculum, which is really meant to start at zero with beginners and give you a broad range. And I'm working with Joanna and Jane right now to develop actually an textile extension, because they only have a robotics one, and that just can't be right, you know. Because e-textiles is kind of robotics for girls, you know, pink if you want. It's the same complexity in terms of, you know, you design circuits, you design structures, you program things, and so we'll add that. There are lots of different examples. Scratch has just created, Karen Brennan, a creative computing guide, which has a sequence of projects. But there is no program because many states don't even have a certification for computer science teachers, so there was no incentive for ed schools to create a program. To make it even worse, if teachers got certified, they got certified in home economics, which, you know, makes the idea of becoming a computer science teacher really attractive. And so this is all changing now. If you go to the CSTA, the Computer Science Teachers Association, ACM has also developed a curriculum, and you can find a lot of information there. And they're keeping track on how the states now progressively offering certification and where there are programs. But we gave up on that infrastructure, no matter how bad it was 20 years ago, and need to recreate everything right now. And it's, I think, a very daunting task with everything else, what's plaguing teacher education right now, whether it's the traditional programs, whether it's the TFA programs, or anything else. But I think it's a problem we'll have to tackle in some way or the other. If you want to look at one successful example, Israel has probably the longest standing CS curriculum in history. And the UK just started last year a nationwide effort to do it everywhere. So that's the situation. Yeah.
I think building on that and the point that you made earlier, that really the way to go with this is to integrate it. That's what I heard. Integrate it into other subjects. So rather than having maybe the CS teacher and CS class in which you learn whatever it is you learn, it's disconnected. I'm wondering if there are ways, and so this suddenly got me thinking when I prepare my biology teachers, if there are ways of helping them use some of these tools, either to make games about the topic, like fractions, or even more like aggregate model kinds of stuff like that logo does. So the net logos programming is not easy.
I know.
I know they say it's easy.
But Scratch, you can build simulations in Scratch much easier.
So that, I mean, that would be useful.
You know, since we don't really have a model of a K-12 curriculum, I mean, my idea, especially for elementary and middle school, would really be the integrative approach. Because honestly, there's no room in the school day to add just another piece. And I think it kind of can beautifully, I mean, reinforce each other when you design. Instructional software can be on any topic, whether it's math or science. You can kind of, you know, again, the idea is also that kids don't create things from scratch. You know, you can kind of come with prefabricated modules, which kids remix and modify, and can have more targeted modules around simulations for science in biology and other areas. You can do storytelling. So Quinn Work actually developed a whole curriculum modeled on the writer's workshop for programming stories and tying this to state standards. So I think there are models out there, but that's not necessarily, you know, a collection of models doesn't necessarily whole curriculum where you start out, but then also build upon. I mean, whether you want to call it learning progressions or knowledge integration, you know, there needs to be a thought of moving beyond the first project. So beyond the hour of code, if you want. Hour of Code was very successful in raising awareness. but it's just an hour. And I think one of the main challenges, I know that from the last 20 years of researching and designing tools for programming novices, that it gets exponentially harder. Probably like many things, the first things are fairly easy, but then once you go into data structure and other pieces, and I don't think no matter what you do, I don't want to sugarcoat it, it's not easy. I mean, the video makes it kind of like, oh, everybody can do it, but it's hard, you really have to spend time and hard work, and everyone who works in this area does. And I think sometimes in education, we have a tendency to figure out whether games or something can kind of make it easier, but I think the hard work still needs to be done. Just a little side sweep at my instructionist gaming colleagues, because I think the idea of making your own games for learning is a much better approach for serious gaming than playing the game somebody else has designed or thinking about combinations thereof. Yeah.
Well, I have a more concrete question. I know that Scratch can be used for programming of Lego Redo and Arduino and some other stuff. Do you have any plans of connecting this textile movement with Scratch so the girl could program in Scratch and then?
It already exists. It's called ModKit. And it's also the people who were involved in Scratch ModKit, M-O-D-Kit.
But it's not online, I guess. I mean, you cannot just open in Scratch commands and...
No, because the thing is, when you work with a physical computer, tangible artifacts, you have the physical artifact which you can't put on the screen. Mm-hmm. So unlike the Scratch program, which you can share with a click of a button, the artifact always remains with you. And it's, even with 3D printing and everything, where you could share files which you have created to make something and then somebody else could create it, the textiles are unique. And that actually is also a major point of motivation, because the robots you can't really take home, especially if it's from a competition. Nobody hugs their robot. The textiles, they're variable, they're personal variables, so they can actually something which you can take home. But so there are versions which have the visual interface for e-textiles, but the sharing, remember, there's some research done on how, we can create better translations, but that's still in the works.
I think we're going to end it there. If you want to ask some follow-up questions, I'm sure Yasmin will be around for a
and I got MIT Press eventually to give a 30% discount on all my books, because I'm now making, so it's valid until December. They had a hard time. I don't know why they didn't want to share, but so.
All right. Drew, did you have something?
Yeah, just one quick announcement. We've got a couple of openings for